Hazel Kwan did not try the door handle. She stood in the center of the study, still in her wool coat, her briefcase in one hand, and she listened to the dead bolt slide home on the other side with the finality of a period at the end of a very short sentence. Then she set her briefcase on the leather chair, removed her coat, laid it flat over the armrest, and walked to the window. Lake Superior spread out below the ridge, grey and enormous and indifferent, the late November sky pressing down on it like a lid. The estate sat on a rocky outcrop above the tree line, accessible by a single gravel road she'd watched disappear into birch forest for 20 minutes before the car stopped. 2 men with rifles patrolled the dock. Another stood at the base of the stone steps leading down from the terrace. She was not getting out that way. Hazel turned from the window and began to take inventory. It was not a cell. It was a private study with 12-foot ceilings, a gas fireplace currently unlit, a mahogany desk, and 3 walls of bookshelves that she suspected existed for aesthetics rather than reading. On the desk, a green-shaded banker's lamp, a crystal decanter of something amber and, more useful to her than anything else in the room, an open accordion file stuffed with printed spreadsheets. She pulled up the chair, spread the sheets across the desk surface, and started reading. By the time the lock clicked open again, 4 hours had passed. Hazel had finished the decanter's first 2 fingers, reorganized the sheets by fiscal quarter, and circled 11 separate anomalies in red from a pen she'd found in the desk drawer. She did not look up when the door opened. "You should have password protected these," she said without turning around. "Any competent auditor walking through your door would reach the same conclusions I did in under 2 hours. Silence, then footsteps, measured even, the walk of a man accustomed to rooms that quieted when he entered them. "You reorganized my files," said a voice that belonged to someone who had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. "They were organized by date of printing," Hazel said. "That's not organization. That's hoarding." She finally turned in the chair. Reid Sinclair was taller than she'd expected. She had seen photographs, surveillance shots from the federal tip file that had landed on her supervisor's desk 3 weeks ago, sent via anonymous routing to the forensic accounting department at Lavoie and Partners in Toronto. In those photos, Sinclair had looked like any other man in an expensive suit. In person, he looked like something older than that. He was in his early 40s, with dark hair silvering at the temples, and a face that had been reassembled from separate incidents. A scar bisected his left eyebrow. Another ran jaw to collar along the right side of his neck. He was holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't yet drunk, and he was looking at her the way a person looks at a lock they don't recognize on a door they own. "You're not scared," Sinclair said. "I'm a forensic accountant from Scarborough," Hazel replied. "Being scared doesn't close the discrepancy." He pulled the second chair from the corner, set it across the desk from her, and sat down. The glass went on the surface between them, untouched. "What discrepancy?" "The one in your Northern Transport Division." She turned the top sheet toward him and tapped the column she'd circled twice. "Someone is billing ghost mileage on the Sudbury route. 43 runs logged against fuel costs that don't match the odometer data your own dispatch records show. Whoever's doing it has been at it for 8 months. If you're running the books the way I think you're running the books, the actual skimming is probably 3 times the number visible here." Sinclair looked at the sheet for a long time. "My accountant handles the Sudbury division," he said. "Your accountant is either the problem or being used as a relay point by whoever is." Hazel gathered the sheets back into their correct order. "I'll need access to the source files to tell you which. Not these printouts, the actual server records." He was quiet for a moment that stretched uncomfortably. "You walked into a meeting you weren't supposed to leave," Sinclair said. "You know that." "I know that. And you want to audit my books." "I was already auditing your books," Hazel said. "I've been doing it for 11 days on behalf of a client who claims to be a third-party logistics company, but is actually running intelligence for the Federal Organized Crime Task Force." She met his gaze without blinking. I'm telling you this because you clearly already know, which is why I'm in this room instead of on the highway, and because the people who hired me to investigate you are also the people you should be more worried about right now than me." Something shifted in Sinclair's expression, not warmth, more like an adjustment, the reappraisal of a variable that had been misclassified. "Why?" he said. "Because whoever tipped them off to start this investigation had access to your northern transport data." She tapped the spreadsheet again. Same ghost mileage. They handed the task force a thread. I was the auditor they brought in to pull it. The gas fireplace in the corner clicked on. Neither of them had touched the switch. Sinclair picked up his whiskey glass, held it, set it back down without drinking. "You could be lying," he said. "I could be," Hazel agreed. "But if I am, you've lost nothing by giving me server access. And if I'm not, you have a leak large enough to drain you before spring." She folded her hands on the desk. "I want to go home. The fastest route home is helping you find whoever is feeding the task force. So, do you want to find your leak or not?" 3 days passed. The study became her office. Sinclair sent a laptop the following morning, scrubbed clean of outbound capability, tethered to a local server she could read but not write to, and Hazel worked with the systematic patience of someone who had grown up doing tax returns on a folding table in a Scarborough apartment while her mother worked double shifts at St. Mike's. Numbers were never complicated to her. People spent their whole lives trying to hide things in columns and rows, and they always forgot that columns and rows were just stories, and stories had patterns, and Hazel Kwan had been reading patterns since she was 8 years old. A housekeeper named Clara brought meals. The guards outside the door didn't speak. The lake stayed grey and unchanged. On the 3rd evening, Sinclair came back. He looked worse than he had on the first night. His shirt was untucked, the collar open, and there was a tightness around his mouth that hadn't been there before. He dropped into the chair across from her without asking, and poured 2 fingers of whiskey from the decanter. "You found something," he said, watching her face rather than the screen. "Your accountant isn't the problem." Hazel turned the laptop toward him. "He's being routed through. Whoever's doing this created a secondary authorization layer in the transport system 3 months before the ghost mileage started. They needed your accountant's credentials. Either they have them, or they have access to someone who does." She pointed at the screen. "Every fraudulent entry comes through a time-stamped window between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. on nights when your northern operations manager is logged as on-site." Sinclair went very still. "Whitley," he said. "Is that the operations manager?" "He's been with me for 6 years." 6 years and 3 months, Hazel said. "I checked his onboarding date. He was hired 4 months before the secondary authorization label appeared in the system. She let that sit. He didn't build it the day he arrived. He waited. That's not opportunism. That's a long game." Sinclair set his glass down hard enough that the lamp rattled. He was quiet for too long. Long enough that Hazel became aware of something she'd been carefully not thinking about for 3 days. The sheer compressed weight of the room with both of them in it. He was across a desk from her, but she could feel what he was carrying. The specific exhaustion of trusting something that had been quietly working against you for years. She recognized it from her own life. She'd spent 2 years trusting a firm partner who had stripped her work of her name before she was cut loose, when the Lavoie partners needed someone to take the blame for a lost client. "You're going to want to move carefully," Hazel said, her voice quieter than she intended. "If he's feeding the task force, arresting him, or whatever you do, might accelerate their timeline. You need to know what he's already handed over. And how do I find that out? You let me pull his communication logs from the server. I can cross-reference timestamps against the task force's documented contact schedule." She paused. "I'll need more access than I currently have." Sinclair looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were dark and calculating, but underneath the calculation was something she recognized from the mirror on bad mornings. A person running on less than they had the month before, and the month before that, and not quite knowing where the floor was anymore. "Why are you helping me?" he said, not a threat, a genuine question with a rough edge to it. Hazel considered being honest. "Because the task force doesn't care about justice," she said finally. "They care about a successful prosecution, and they'll use every person connected to this file as a stepping stone to get it, including me." She met his gaze. "I'm not your ally, Sinclair. I'm a person with parallel interests." He nodded once, slowly, as though she had confirmed something he'd already suspected. "I'll get you the access," he said, and left. She found the full scope of it by midnight. Whitley hadn't just been selling transport data. He'd been selling personnel schedules, authorization codes, and, most damning, the offshore account routing numbers that Sinclair's estate used to manage operational liquidity. The task force had enough to freeze every account within 48 hours. What they were waiting for was confirmation of Sinclair's physical location. Whitley had given them that location 2 hours ago. Hazel had the satellite map open on the laptop when she heard the sound from the hallway, not the even tread of the night guard, but something unsteady, heavier on one side, dragging slightly against the wall. She was at the door before she'd made the decision to move. She opened it herself. Sinclair was in the hallway, his left hand braced against the wood paneling, his right hand clamped to his side beneath his jacket. The jacket was dark enough that the stain didn't register immediately. Then the lamplight caught the wet sheen of it, and her stomach dropped clean through the floor. "Inside," she said right now. Whitley had a contact on the perimeter. "I know, I just found it, inside." She got her shoulder under his arm and took more of his weight than she expected. He was heavier than he looked, and considerably more wounded. When she got him to the leather chair and pulled his hand away, the gash across his lower ribs was deep and bleeding freely through a field dressing someone had applied badly in the dark. "Who stitched this?" she said. "I did." "With what?" "A fishing kit from the emergency locker in the garage." Hazel went to the study's private washroom, found the first aid cabinet behind the mirror, stocked, she noted, with actual trauma supplies, which told her everything she needed to know about what kind of household this was, and came back with everything she could carry. "Don't pass out," she said. "I'm not going to pass out." "You said that with a lot of confidence for someone who just sewed their own ribs with fishing line." She knelt and began removing the improvised dressing. "I need you to stay awake and talk to me. Where is Whitley now?" "Contained. Bowen has him in the equipment shed." "And the task force?" "They'll move on the road by morning, if they don't hear from their contact. Which means we have roughly 6 hours." She opened the antiseptic. "This is going to hurt." "I'm aware." She poured. He made a sound low in his throat, and his hand shot out and gripped her forearm, not pulling, just holding on. The pressure was enormous. She let him. When it passed, she began to work, and because she needed him conscious and because silence between them had gotten strange without her quite noticing when it happened, she talked while she worked. "The offshore accounts," she said, threading the needle with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "The task force has the routing numbers. They haven't moved yet because they're waiting for you to be in custody first. They want to freeze everything simultaneously so nothing gets shifted. But if we restructure the routing in the next 4 hours and flag the compromised accounts as internally suspended, with a paper trail that looks like a routine compliance audit, we can neutralize the seizure. They'll execute the freeze on empty shells." He turned his head to look at her, even half destroyed by blood loss and pain. His gaze was sharper than most people's at full capacity. "You know how to do that," he said. "I spent 8 years auditing the mechanisms people use to hide money," Hazel said. "I know how it works from both sides." She tied the third knot and sat back. "I need your authorization codes for the primary accounts." A silence opened between them. She understood what she was asking. The codes weren't just access. They were trust, which was something neither of them had been dispensing freely for a very long time. She waited. 7 Delta 942, Sinclair said quietly. Then your first initial and my last name as a compound. Hazel looked at him for a moment. H. Sinclair, she said. Yes. She turned to the laptop and started working. It took 3.5 hours. By the time the eastern sky over the lake had gone from black to the specific deep blue that precedes a northern sunrise, Hazel had restructured 4 accounts, built a compliance paper trail robust enough to survive a federal audit, and identified every point of contact between Whitley and the task force going back 14 months. She compiled it into a single encrypted file and saved it to the local server under a name she chose deliberately. H. Kwan, internal review, completed. She sat back in the chair. Sinclair had stayed. He'd moved from the leather chair to the couch at some point and was sitting upright against the cushions, jacket off, the bandaged wound visible through his open shirt. He was awake. She realized he had been watching her work for most of the last hour. It's done, she said. I know. His voice was quieter than she'd heard it. I watched you build it. The fire was still going. Outside, the blue deepened, and the first birds started somewhere in the birch trees. Normal sounds, strange context. Whitley, Hazel said. Bowen will handle it. And the task force handler, the contact Whitley was reporting to. The file you just built is enough to discredit any testimony he could give. Sinclair paused. You built it for me. I built it for my own immunity, Hazel said. You built it for both of us. She didn't argue. She stood, stretched the ache out of her back, and walked to the window. The lake was lightening at the edges. A heron stood motionless on the dock, indifferent to the night's events. She heard Sinclair move behind her. He came to stand beside her at the window. Not close, but present. She could feel the warmth of him the way you feel a fireplace from across a room. You can leave, he said. Bowen will drive you back to Toronto. The road is clear. Hazel looked at the lake. She thought about the Scarborough apartment she'd sublet while on assignment. She thought about the task force file she'd just quietly dismantled. She thought about the moment she'd opened the study door in the dark hallway and walked toward the sound of someone in trouble before she'd stopped to calculate whether she should. The compliance restructuring needs monitoring for the next 30 days, she said. If anyone at the task force notices the account migration, they'll flag it for secondary review. You'll need someone on the inside of that process. A pause. That's a reason to stay for 30 days, Sinclair said. Not a reason to stay tonight. Hazel turned from the window and met his gaze. Tonight I stay because the coffee in this place is better than anything within 200 kilometers of my apartment. She moved past him back to the desk and picked up her pen. And because you owe me access to the Q3 files, I found 3 other anomalies I haven't had time to address. Sinclair watched her settle into the chair and spread the sheets across the desk. After a moment, he pulled his chair around to her side of the desk, sat down close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and looked at the column she was circling. Walk me through it, he said. She did. Outside, the heron lifted off the dock without warning and vanished into the pale northern sky. The lake held its color, gray turning slowly reluctantly to silver. Inside, 2 people who had stopped trusting the world a long time ago sat side by side over a set of numbers that neither of them had intended to share, and the morning came in around the edges of the window whether either of them was ready for it or not. Hazel Kwan was not the woman who had walked into that meeting 11 days ago, expecting a routine file handover and a 4-hour drive back to the city. She understood that now, in the quiet, specific way, you understand something that has already changed before you had a chance to decide whether you wanted it to. The numbers had always made sense to her. Whatever this was, whatever name it would eventually need, it made a different kind of sense. And for the first time in a very long while, she wasn't afraid of a ledger she hadn't finished reading yet.